When Private First Class John Basilone picked up the Browning M1917 machine gun during the Battle of Guadalcanal, his commanding officer told him it was a waste of time. The weapon weighed nearly 50 pounds without ammunition. With a full belt of rounds, the total weight exceeded 80 pounds. No single man could effectively carry and operate such a beast in the dense jungles of the Pacific. It was designed to be mounted on a tripod and operated by a crew of at least 2 soldiers. But John Basilone was not an ordinary Marine. If you want to hear how this impossible feat unfolded and how one man's determination changed the course of an entire battle, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. You will not want to miss what happens next. The story begins not in the jungles of the Pacific, but in the immigrant neighborhoods of early 20th century America. Salvatore Basilone had left Naples, Italy, in the early 1900s, carrying nothing but a small suitcase and dreams of a better life. He arrived at Ellis Island with thousands of other hopeful immigrants, passed through the crowded processing halls, and eventually made his way to Buffalo, New York. Salvatore was a tailor by trade, skilled with needle and thread in ways that had been passed down through generations of his family. In the old country, tailoring was a respected profession, and Salvatore hoped to build a successful business in his new homeland. He worked long hours in cramped shops, saving every penny he could. He met Dora Bencivenga, another Italian immigrant, at a community gathering in Buffalo. She was quiet and hard-working, with a practical approach to life that complemented Salvatore's dreamer tendencies. They married in a simple ceremony and began building a family. The Basilones eventually settled in Raritan, New Jersey, a small town that had attracted many Italian immigrant families. The community there was tight-knit, with neighbors looking out for each other and children playing together in the streets. Salvatore opened a small tailoring shop and began to establish himself in his new community. John Basilone was born on November 4, 1916, the 6th of 10 children. The Basilone household was crowded and noisy, with barely enough room for everyone. The children shared beds and hand-me-down clothes. Meals were simple but plentiful, heavy on pasta and vegetables from the small garden behind the house. From his earliest days, John was different from his siblings. While the others adapted to the rhythms of school and family life, John seemed driven by an internal restlessness that nothing could satisfy. He would disappear for hours, exploring the woods and fields around Raritan. He would get into fights with other boys, not out of malice, but out of an excess of energy that demanded physical release. His teachers found him frustrating. John was clearly intelligent, able to grasp concepts quickly when he bothered to pay attention, but he rarely bothered to pay attention. He spent his classroom hours staring out the window, dreaming of adventures that seemed impossibly far from the small brick schoolhouse in Raritan. Salvatore hoped that his son would eventually settle down and join him in the tailoring business. He tried to teach John the basics of the trade, showing him how to cut fabric and sew straight seams. But John's hands, which would later prove capable of incredible precision with machinery, seemed clumsy and impatient with needle and thread. The one place where John seemed to find focus was the boxing ring. The local gymnasium offered boxing lessons for young men, and John took to the sport immediately. He loved the discipline of it, the way success depended on skill and conditioning rather than size or social status. He trained obsessively, spending hours punching bags and sparring with other young boxers. By his teenage years, John had developed a reputation as a tough kid who could handle himself in a fight. He was not a bully, those who knew him insisted. He simply did not back down from challenges, and there were plenty of challenges in the rough neighborhoods of 1930s New Jersey. The Great Depression had hit Raritan hard. Many families struggled to put food on the table. Young men who should have been starting careers found themselves unemployed and directionless. The despair of the era drove some to crime, others to desperation, and many to the military. In 1934, at the age of 18, John Basilone walked into a United States Army recruiting office. He was not motivated by patriotism or dreams of glory. He simply saw the military as a way out, a chance to escape the poverty and monotony of his current life. The Army offered 3 meals a day, a paycheck, and the possibility of seeing something beyond the streets of Raritan. The recruiter looked at the young man standing before him. John was not particularly tall or imposing, but there was something in his eyes that suggested inner strength. The recruiter had seen many young men come through his office during the Depression years, most of them desperate and broken. John was different. He seemed eager rather than defeated. John signed his enlistment papers and shipped out for basic training. The structure of military life suited him in ways that civilian life never had. He discovered that he actually enjoyed following orders, as long as those orders made sense. He excelled in physical training, his years of boxing having prepared him for the demands of military conditioning. But it was weapons training that revealed John Basilone's true calling. The first time John handled a military firearm, something clicked inside him. He seemed to understand intuitively how the weapon worked, how the parts fitted together, how to maintain and repair the complex mechanisms. His instructors noticed his aptitude and began giving him additional training opportunities. After completing basic training, John was assigned to the Philippines, where the United States maintained a significant military presence. The journey across the Pacific was his first time on a ship, his first time seeing the ocean stretch to the horizon in every direction. He spent hours on deck, watching the water and dreaming of what lay ahead. The Philippines in the late 1930s was a world apart from New Jersey. The tropical heat was oppressive, the humidity unlike anything John had experienced. The culture was exotic and fascinating, a mixture of indigenous traditions and Spanish colonial influence. The local people spoke languages John had never heard, ate foods he had never tasted, lived lives that seemed impossibly different from his own. John loved it. He loved the adventure of being so far from home. He loved the camaraderie of his fellow soldiers, men from all across America who had come together in this distant outpost. He loved the challenge of adapting to a new environment, of proving himself capable in unfamiliar circumstances. Most of all, he loved the weapons. The army in the Philippines maintained a diverse arsenal, including many weapons that John had never seen before. He spent every spare moment in the armory, examining the different firearms and learning their characteristics. The sergeants in charge of weapons maintenance noticed his enthusiasm and began allowing him to help with cleaning and repairs. It was in the Philippines that John Basilone first encountered the Browning M1917 heavy machine gun. The M1917 was a formidable weapon, one of the most effective machine guns ever designed. It had been developed during World War I to meet the demands of trench warfare, where sustained automatic fire could mean the difference between holding a position and being overrun. The weapon was belt-fed and water-cooled, capable of firing continuously for extended periods without overheating, but the M1917 came with significant drawbacks. The weapon itself weighed nearly 50 pounds. The tripod added another 50 pounds. The water jacket required constant monitoring and maintenance. The ammunition belts were heavy and awkward to handle. Operating the M1917 effectively required a crew of at least 2 men, and ideally 4 or more. Most soldiers viewed the M1917 as a necessary evil, a weapon to be deployed from fixed positions and operated by specialists. The idea of a single man carrying and firing the weapon in mobile combat seemed absurd. John Basilone looked at the M1917 and saw something different. He saw a weapon of incredible power, capable of devastating effect if used correctly. He saw a tool that could change the outcome of battles if someone was willing to master it completely. He saw a challenge, and John Basilone never backed down from a challenge. He began spending every free moment with the M1917. He learned to disassemble it completely, memorizing the function of every part and the precise order of reassembly. He practiced until he could perform the entire process blindfolded, his hands moving with automatic precision. He learned the sounds the weapon made when functioning properly, the subtle changes in rhythm that indicated problems with feeding or firing. He learned to diagnose issues by feel, identifying worn parts and loose connections through touch alone. He practiced carrying the weapon across difficult terrain. At first, the weight was nearly impossible to manage. His arms ached and his back screamed in protest. But John was stubborn, and he gradually built up the strength and endurance necessary to move with the heavy gun. His fellow soldiers thought he was crazy. No one carried an M1917 by themselves. It simply was not done. But John continued his private training regimen, and gradually what had seemed impossible became merely difficult. The soldiers in the Philippines started calling him Manila John, a nickname that acknowledged both his location and his growing reputation as an expert with the heavy weapons. The name would follow him for the rest of his life. John's enlistment ended in 1937, and he returned to the United States. He settled back in Raritan and found work as a truck driver for a local laundry company. The job was steady and respectable, exactly the kind of stable employment his parents had always wanted for him. But John was miserable. After the excitement of the Philippines, civilian life seemed unbearably dull. He drove his delivery routes through the familiar streets of New Jersey, remembering the tropical jungles and exotic cultures he had left behind. He spent his evenings in local bars, drinking with other veterans and telling stories about their military days. The years passed slowly. John dated several women, but never found anyone who understood his restlessness. He considered various careers, but never committed to anything that would tie him down permanently. He was waiting for something, though he could not have said what. Then came December 7th, 1941. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor stunned the nation. The Sunday morning assault destroyed much of the American Pacific Fleet and killed over 2,000 servicemen. President Franklin Roosevelt addressed Congress the following day, calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy and asking for a declaration of war. For John Basilone, the news was not shocking so much as clarifying. He had spent years waiting for something to give his life purpose and direction. Now he knew what that something was. He did not return to the army. Instead, he walked into a Marine Corps recruiting station. The Marines had a reputation as the toughest branch of the military, the first to fight and the most likely to see the heaviest combat. If America was going to war, John wanted to be at the very front. The Marine Corps welcomed him eagerly. His previous military experience meant he was already trained in basic soldiering, and his expertise with heavy weapons made him valuable. He was quickly promoted to sergeant and assigned to the 1st Marine Division. The 1st Marine Division was one of the most storied units in the Marine Corps, with a history stretching back to World War I. The division was preparing for deployment to the Pacific, where the Japanese had conquered vast territories and seemed unstoppable. John threw himself into the preparations with characteristic intensity. He trained his assigned machine gun section relentlessly, drilling them until they could operate in complete darkness and maintain their weapons under any conditions. He shared the expertise he had developed in the Philippines, teaching techniques that no manual covered. His men initially resented the demanding sergeant, who seemed never to be satisfied. But as their skills improved and their confidence grew, resentment turned to respect. They began to understand that John Basilone was preparing them for something that would require everything they had. The 1st Marine Division shipped out in June 1942, bound for the South Pacific. Their destination was kept secret, but rumors circulated through the ship about a Japanese-held island called Guadalcanal. The Solomon Islands chain stretched across the South Pacific like a broken necklace. Guadalcanal was the largest island in the chain, a mass of jungle-covered mountains and swampy coastal plains. The Japanese had occupied the island in early 1942 and were constructing an airfield that would allow their bombers to threaten Allied shipping and potentially strike Australia itself. American military planners recognized the strategic importance of the island. If the Japanese completed their airfield, they would gain air superiority over a huge swathe of the Pacific. The airfield had to be captured or destroyed. The invasion began on August 7, 1942. The Marines landed on the northern coast of Guadalcanal and quickly captured the partially completed Japanese airfield. They renamed it Henderson Field after a Marine pilot killed at the Battle of Midway. The initial success was deceptive. The Japanese had no intention of surrendering the island. Over the following weeks, they poured reinforcements onto Guadalcanal, bringing troops, ammunition and supplies by night on fast destroyers that the Marines called the Tokyo Express. The situation on Guadalcanal deteriorated rapidly. The American Navy had withdrawn most of its ships after a disastrous night battle, leaving the Marines without adequate supplies or support. The men survived on captured Japanese rice and whatever they could forage from the jungle. Malaria spread through the camp, weakening men who were already exhausted from constant combat. The Marines dug in around Henderson Field and prepared for the inevitable Japanese counterattack. John Basilone and his machine gun section were positioned on a ridge overlooking the airfield, directly in the path that any attacking force would have to take. John spent the tense weeks preparing his position with obsessive attention to detail. He positioned his two M1917 machine guns to create overlapping fields of fire, ensuring that any assault would face devastating crossfire. He stockpiled ammunition, counting every belt of rounds and calculating how long he could sustain fire under different scenarios. He studied the terrain, identifying the likely avenues of approach and the dead zones where attackers might find cover. He had his men clear brush and vegetation to improve their sightlines. He positioned secondary weapons and established fallback points in case the primary positions were overrun. Most importantly, he drilled his men until they could operate in complete darkness. Japanese tactics favored night attacks, using the cover of darkness to close with enemy positions before defenders could bring their full firepower to bear. John knew that when the attack came, his men would have to fight by instinct and training alone. The attack came on the night of October 24, 1942. The rain had been falling for hours, a tropical downpour that reduced visibility to nearly zero and turned the ground into a sea of mud. The Marines huddled in their foxholes, their weapons slick with moisture, straining to hear any sound above the constant drumming of the rain. Japanese scouts had been probing the Marine positions for days, testing the defenses and looking for weaknesses. The main assault force had gathered in the jungle, 3,000 soldiers prepared to throw themselves against the American lines. Their commanders had promised them victory, assuring them that the starving and diseased Marines would break under the weight of a determined attack. At approximately 11 o'clock, the Japanese launched their assault. They came out of the jungle screaming, their voices rising above the rain in a terrifying chorus. They had tied themselves together with their rifle slings so they would not become separated in the darkness. They were prepared to die for their emperor, confident that their sacrifice would bring victory. John Basilone was ready for them. His machine guns opened fire, the heavy stutter of the M1917s cutting through the night. The muzzle flashes illuminated the charging Japanese soldiers in strobe-like bursts, freezing them in moments of desperate motion before they fell. The belt-fed weapons spat continuous streams of bullets, each round capable of killing at ranges far beyond what the attacking soldiers could effectively return fire. Other Marines along the line joined in, their rifles and automatic weapons creating a wall of lead that no human being could survive. The noise was overwhelming, the combined roar of hundreds of weapons drowning out the screams of the attacking soldiers and the defenders alike. But the Japanese kept coming. They had been taught that spiritual strength could overcome material disadvantage. They believed that their willingness to die made them invincible. They climbed over the bodies of their fallen comrades and continued forward, throwing themselves at the American positions with savage determination. Some of them reached the Marine foxholes. The fighting became hand-to-hand, desperate struggles in the mud and rain between men who could barely see each other. Bayonets and rifle butts replaced bullets. Grenades exploded at close range, killing attackers and defenders indiscriminately. John Basilone moved between his two machine gun positions, keeping both weapons firing despite the chaos around him. When one gun jammed from the wet conditions, he cleared it with hands that never trembled. When one gun ran low on ammunition, he sprinted through the maelstrom to bring more belts from the supply point. The first wave of attackers was finally repulsed, leaving hundreds of bodies scattered across the muddy ground. But the Japanese commander simply ordered more men forward. The second wave was larger than the first, thousands of soldiers emerging from the jungle in a human tide. John's machine guns cut into them, but there were so many. Some of them made it through the curtain of fire and reached the Marine positions. More hand-to-hand fighting erupted along the line. A Marine nearby fell with a Japanese bayonet in his chest. Another took a bullet to the head and dropped without a sound. The second wave was eventually driven back, but at terrible cost. John's section had suffered casualties, and one of his machine guns had been damaged beyond immediate repair. Ammunition was running dangerously low. The rain continued to fall, making everything more difficult. There was a brief lull as the Japanese regrouped in the jungle. John used the time to assess his situation. He was down to one functioning machine gun and a handful of men. The ammunition supply point was running low. Another major assault would be difficult to repel. But he knew the Japanese would attack again. They had committed too many forces to stop now. They would keep coming until they broke through or until they were all dead. John made a decision that would define his legend. He picked up the remaining M1917, its water jacket still hot enough to burn through his uniform, and carried it to a new position. The weapon and its remaining ammunition weighed close to 90 pounds, but John moved with desperate urgency. He knew that the current position was too exposed, too obvious. The Japanese had identified it during their attacks and would concentrate their next assault there. The new position gave him a better angle on the approaches and more cover from enemy fire. He set up the gun and waited. The Japanese launched their third assault around 2 in the morning. It was their largest yet, a massive human wave designed to overwhelm the Marine defenses through sheer numbers. Thousands of soldiers charged out of the jungle, their screams echoing across the battlefield. John Basilone opened fire. The M1917 roared continuously, its barrel glowing red in the darkness. John traversed the weapon back and forth, methodically cutting down Japanese soldiers as fast as they appeared. He had fired thousands of rounds in training, and now that training took over. His hands moved automatically, feeding ammunition, adjusting aim, maintaining the steady rhythm of fire. The barrel grew hotter and hotter. The water in the cooling jacket began to boil, sending steam hissing into the night air. The metal burned John's hands and arms, but he did not stop. He could not stop. The Marines, depending on him, had no one else. 15 minutes. That was how long the main assault lasted. 15 minutes of continuous fire, of Japanese soldiers falling in waves before they could close with the American lines. 15 minutes of John Basilone holding his position alone, because the men who should have been fighting beside him were either dead or wounded. When the Japanese finally fell back, Unable to sustain their assault against the murderous fire, John Basilone had personally killed at least 60 enemy soldiers. Some estimates placed the number much higher. The ground before his position was carpeted with Japanese dead, piled in heaps where they had fallen attempting to breach the Marine lines. But the night was not over. The Japanese attacked again before dawn, a final desperate attempt to break through before daylight exposed them to American air power. John Basilone fought through this assault as well, his machine gun chattering until the barrel was nearly molten and the ammunition was almost exhausted. When the sun rose on October 25th, the Marines surveyed a battlefield that defied description. More than 1,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead before the American positions. Many more had been wounded and had crawled away to die in the jungle. The attacking force had been effectively destroyed as a fighting unit. John Basilone had held his section of the line through 2 nights and days of nearly continuous combat. He had not slept. He had barely eaten. He had fired so many rounds that the spare barrels for his machine gun had warped from the heat. His commanding officer found him sitting beside his weapon, hands blistered and bleeding, uniform torn and filthy, staring at the carnage before him with exhausted eyes. The officer asked if he was all right. John Basilone looked up and said he could use some ammunition. The Battle of Henderson Field continued for another day, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Japanese offensive had been broken. They had thrown their best troops against the Marine positions and had been slaughtered. The Tokyo Express could not replace casualties quickly enough to maintain the assault. By the end of October, it was clear that the Americans would hold Guadalcanal. The airfield would remain operational. The Japanese advance in the South Pacific had been stopped. John Basilone was recommended for the Medal of Honor, the highest decoration for valor in the United States military. His commanding officer wrote a citation that detailed his actions during the battle, emphasizing that his contribution had been essential to the successful defense of Henderson Field. The recommendation worked its way through military channels as the fighting on Guadalcanal continued. John remained with his unit, fighting through the remaining weeks of the campaign until the 1st Marine Division was finally relieved in December 1942. By then, malaria and exhaustion had reduced the division to a shadow of its former strength. John Basilone was among the most exhausted of all. He had lost weight he could not afford to lose. His body was racked by tropical diseases, but he had survived, which was more than could be said for many of the men he had fought beside. On May 21, 1943, John Basilone returned to the United States. He was summoned to Washington, D.C., where President Franklin Roosevelt personally presented him with the Medal of Honor in a ceremony at the White House. The ceremony was brief, but deeply moving. President Roosevelt shook John's hand and thanked him for his extraordinary service. The Medal of Honor, a 5-pointed star hanging from a blue ribbon, was placed around John's neck. Photographs captured the moment for newspapers across the country. John Basilone had become a national hero. The Marine Corps recognized immediately that they had something valuable in this soft-spoken machine gunner from New Jersey. The war effort needed more than soldiers and weapons. It needed symbols, stories that could inspire the home front to sacrifice and contribute. John was assigned to a war bond tour, traveling across the country to encourage Americans to buy war bonds. He appeared at rallies and parades, shook hands with movie stars and politicians, gave speeches to crowds of adoring civilians. His face appeared in newspapers and newsreels, the embodiment of American courage and determination. The fame was overwhelming for a man who had grown up poor in a small New Jersey town. John found himself staying in fancy hotels, eating elaborate meals, attending parties with celebrities he had only seen in movies. Women threw themselves at him wherever he went, drawn to the combination of heroism and quiet modesty that made him irresistible. But John Basilone was deeply uncomfortable with his celebrity status. He understood the importance of the war bond tours. He knew that the money raised would buy weapons and supplies for the men still fighting in the Pacific. He did his duty, smiling for the cameras and telling his story to whoever wanted to hear it. But every night he thought about his fellow Marines. He thought about the men who were still fighting and dying on islands he had never heard of. He thought about the young replacements who were shipping out to face an enemy that would show them no mercy. The comfortable hotel rooms and elaborate dinners seemed obscene when he thought about those men eating rice and fighting malaria. The attention and adulation felt hollow when he knew that other soldiers were performing acts of courage just as great as his, with no cameras to record them and no medals to reward them. The fame also highlighted a painful reality that John had always known about himself. He had only a 6th grade education. He could fight like a demon and lead men in combat, but he struggled to give speeches and answer questions from reporters. The social events that came with celebrity made him feel out of place and inadequate. He was a Marine, not a performer. His skills were in fighting, not talking. Every day spent on the Bond tour was a day he was not doing what he had trained his whole adult life to do. After more than a year of touring, John Basilone made a decision that shocked the Marine Corps brass. He requested to return to combat duty. His superiors tried to dissuade him. They argued that he was more valuable selling war bonds than fighting Japanese soldiers. They pointed out that his death would be a propaganda disaster, undermining the very symbol they had worked so hard to create. They offered him compromises. They proposed making him an officer, which would have allowed him to serve in a training capacity far from the front lines. They suggested staff positions where his expertise could be utilized without the risks of combat. John refused everything. He wanted to be a regular Marine again. He wanted to fight alongside the young men who were shipping out to the Pacific every day. He felt that his place was with them, not with the politicians and celebrities who had made him their mascot. The Marine Corps finally relented. In December 1943, John Basilone was assigned to Camp Pendleton in California, where he would help train new Marines in the operation of heavy weapons. It was not quite combat duty, but it was closer to the war than the Bond tour circuit. John threw himself into the work with characteristic intensity, sharing everything he had learned on Guadalcanal with the young Marines who would soon face similar challenges. At Camp Pendleton, John met Lena May Riggy. Lena was a female Marine sergeant, one of the women who had enlisted to support the war effort. She worked as a mess sergeant, responsible for feeding the hungry Marines who passed through Camp Pendleton on their way to the Pacific. She was not like the glamorous women who had pursued John during his celebrity days. She was practical and no-nonsense, more interested in doing her job well than in the fame of the man she was talking to. She had enlisted because she wanted to contribute, not because she wanted adventure or romance. John was immediately attracted to her. Their courtship was brief by any standard. They met in the summer of 1944 and were married on July 10th, less than 6 weeks later. The wedding took place at St. Mary's Star of the Sea Church in Oceanside, California. The ceremony was simple, reflecting both of their practical natures. John wore his dress uniform. Lena wore a suit rather than a traditional wedding gown. Their fellow Marines attended, along with a few family members who could make the journey from the East Coast. They had less than a month together as husband and wife. John had been assigned to the 5th Marine Division, which was preparing for an operation that would become one of the most brutal battles of the Pacific War. The target was a small volcanic island called Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima was strategically vital. Its position between the Mariana Islands and Japan made it an essential staging point for American operations. Aircraft from Iwo Jima could escort the B-29 bombers that were beginning to strike the Japanese homeland. The island's airfields could serve as emergency landing sites for damaged bombers that could not make it back to their bases. The Japanese understood the importance of Iwo Jima as well. They had spent more than a year fortifying the island, constructing an elaborate network of tunnels, bunkers, and artillery positions that would make any invasion incredibly costly. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi commanded the Japanese defenses. He was a skilled and innovative commander who had studied in America before the war and understood his enemy well. He designed a defense in depth that abandoned the traditional Japanese tactic of defending the beaches. Instead, he planned to let the Americans land and then destroy them as they advanced inland. The volcanic rock of Iwo Jima was perfect for his purposes. Japanese engineers carved tunnels and bunkers deep into the earth, creating an underground fortress that could withstand the heaviest bombardment. Artillery and mortars were positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. Machine gun nests were hidden in positions that were nearly impossible to spot from the surface. John Basilone studied the intelligence reports and examined the aerial photographs of Iwo Jima during the voyage across the Pacific. He understood that this would be different from Guadalcanal. The Japanese were not going to charge in human waves this time. They were going to make the Americans come to them, and they were going to make them pay for every yard. He spent the journey preparing his men for what lay ahead. He shared the lessons he had learned in combat, the techniques that had kept him alive when everything suggested he should have died. He emphasized the importance of fire discipline, of maintaining weapons in the harsh conditions they would face, of looking out for each other. Some of the young Marines looked at him with awe, unable to believe they were serving alongside a Medal of Honor recipient. John tried to deflect their admiration. He told them that medals did not make a man bulletproof. He told them that the only way to survive was to do their jobs correctly and watch out for each other. He told them that fear was normal and that courage meant fighting anyway. The invasion began on February 19, 1945. The pre-invasion bombardment had lasted for 3 days, with Navy ships pouring thousands of tons of shells onto the small island. American planners believed that nothing could have survived such devastation. They were wrong. General Kuribayashi had pulled his troops deep underground during the bombardment. They waited in their tunnels and bunkers, listening to the explosions above, knowing that their moment would come. When the bombardment lifted and the American landing craft approached the beaches, the Japanese defenders climbed back to their positions. John Basilone was among the first wave of Marines to hit Red Beach too. The landing craft ground onto the volcanic sand, and the ramp dropped. John led his machine gun section forward, his boots sinking into the coarse black sand that seemed to grip his feet with every step. The beach rose steeply before them, a slope of loose volcanic ash that made forward movement agonizingly slow. For the first few minutes, the landing seemed almost peaceful. The Japanese held their fire, letting the Americans pile up on the beach before revealing the full extent of their defenses. Then, the killing began. Artillery shells exploded among the packed Marines. Machine gun fire swept the beach in deadly arcs. Mortar rounds fell with terrifying accuracy. The hidden Japanese positions opened up simultaneously, transforming the beach into a slaughter pen. Marines fell everywhere John looked. Some were killed instantly, their bodies torn apart by shell fragments. Others were wounded and lay screaming in the black sand, unable to reach cover. The lucky ones found depressions or wrecked vehicles to shelter behind, but even these offered little protection from the murderous crossfire. John Basilone did not take cover. He understood immediately that staying on the beach meant death. The only way to survive was to move forward, to attack the Japanese positions and silence the guns that were destroying his fellow Marines. He rallied his machine gun section and pushed forward, leading them toward a Japanese blockhouse that was pouring fire into the American lines. The concrete fortification seemed impregnable, its firing slits protected by steel plates and sandbags. Other Marines had tried to approach it and had been killed in the attempt. John studied the position with the experienced eye of a veteran. He identified a blind spot in the Japanese fields of fire, a narrow approach that might allow him to get close enough to attack. It was dangerous, perhaps suicidal, but staying on the beach was certain death. He gathered a small group of men and led them toward the blockhouse. They moved in short rushes, covering each other as they advanced. Japanese bullets cracked past their heads. Mortars exploded around them, showering them with volcanic ash and rock fragments. They kept moving. When they reached the blockhouse, John took a demolition charge and worked his way around to the rear. The Japanese defenders were focused on the beach, on the Marines dying in the sand. They did not see him coming. He placed the explosive against the concrete wall and scrambled for cover. The detonation tore open the blockhouse. John and his men rushed the position, killing the surviving defenders in a brief, violent firefight. With the blockhouse eliminated, other Marines were able to advance from the beach. But John Basilone was not finished. He spent the next hour leading his section across the volcanic landscape, attacking Japanese positions and clearing the way for the advancing Marines. He seemed to be everywhere at once, appearing wherever the fighting was heaviest, inspiring his men by his example. He guided a tank through a minefield, walking ahead of the armored vehicle and directing it around the buried explosives. When the tank's crew expressed concern for his safety, he told them that someone had to do it and kept moving forward. He led attacks against machine gun nests that had pinned down entire platoons. He directed fire, coordinated movements, and repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire to gain better positions from which to observe and direct. Around 11 o'clock in the morning, John Basilone led an attack against an airfield at the edge of the beach. Japanese resistance was fierce, and the Marines were taking heavy casualties. Every yard of advance cost American lives. John ran forward to rally his men, to push them through the final yards to the airfield perimeter. He was doing what he had always done, leading from the front, showing his Marines that the impossible was possible if they just kept moving. A mortar round exploded nearby. John Basilone fell. He was killed instantly, along with 4 other Marines who had been following his lead. The men who witnessed his death said he died the way he had lived, at the front of his unit, leading his Marines into battle. The news of John Basilone's death spread quickly through the Marine Corps. Men who had served with him on Guadalcanal wept when they heard. The young Marines he had trained at Camp Pendleton felt the loss of a mentor who had treated them like brothers. The nation mourned a hero who had given everything for his country. John Basilone was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for valor in the United States Navy. His citation praised his valor and aggressive fighting spirit that contributed materially to the success of his company's mission and helped pave the way for its advance against an entrenched enemy force. He remains the only enlisted Marine in World War II to receive both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. His decorations also include the Purple Heart, awarded for his death in combat. The Battle of Iwo Jima continued for another 5 weeks after John Basilone's death. The fighting was some of the most brutal of the entire war. The Marines had to clear the Japanese positions one by one, often using flamethrowers and explosives to root out defenders who refused to surrender. The famous flag raising on Mount Suribachi took place just 4 days after John Basilone fell. The photograph of that moment became one of the most iconic images of World War II, a symbol of American determination and sacrifice. When the battle finally ended on March 26, 1945, the cost had been staggering. Nearly 7,000 Marines had been killed and more than 19,000 wounded. Japanese casualties exceeded 20,000, with only about 200 taken prisoner. The rest had fought to the death. But the sacrifice was not meaningless. The airfields on Iwo Jima provided emergency landing sites for more than 2,400 B-29 bombers during the final months of the war. These landings saved the lives of over 24,000 American airmen who might otherwise have died in the Pacific. The strategic calculus was brutal but clear. The lives lost on Iwo Jima contributed directly to the ultimate victory over Japan. John Basilone's sacrifice was part of this larger story. Lena May Basilone, John's widow, learned of her husband's death through a telegram delivered to her quarters at Camp Pendleton. She'd been married for less than 8 months, and for most of that time, her husband had been training for the operation that would take his life. She never remarried. Lena remained in the Marines until the war ended, then built a quiet life in California. She worked, she volunteered, she kept the memory of her husband alive through the stories she shared with those who asked about him. She attended memorial events and reunions, always composed, always gracious, always clearly proud of the man she had loved. She died in 1999, having spent more than 50 years as the widow of Manila John Basilone. She was buried beside him at the Riverside National Cemetery in California. The town of Raritan honored its native son in ways both large and small. They renamed the main street John Basilone Way. They erected a bronze statue of him in the town square, depicting him in combat with his beloved machine gun. A museum dedicated to his memory opened, displaying artifacts from his life and service. Every year since 1981, Raritan has held the John Basilone Parade, a celebration of courage that draws thousands of visitors. Veterans from across the country attend, marching alongside the current generation of Marines who carry forward the traditions that John embodied. The Marine Corps continues to honor John Basilone throughout its ranks. The mess hall at Camp Pendleton bears his name. A destroyer in the United States Navy, the USS Basilone, sailed the world's oceans for decades before being decommissioned. His story is taught to every Marine who passes through basic training, but perhaps the most important legacy of John Basilone is not the memorials or the awards or the parade. It is the example he set for those who came after him. He showed that courage is not the absence of fear. He was afraid on Guadalcanal, afraid on Iwo Jima, afraid every time he went into battle. But he fought anyway because that was his duty and because other men were counting on him. He showed that true heroes do not seek recognition. John Basilone hated his celebrity status, hated being treated as something special when he was just a Marine doing his duty. He returned to combat not for more medals, but because he could not bear to be safe while others were in danger. He showed that weapons are only as effective as the men who wield them. The Browning M1917 was considered too heavy for individual use, but in John Basilone's hands it became a tool of salvation. His intimate knowledge of the weapon, combined with his absolute determination to hold his position, transformed an awkward piece of equipment into a decisive factor in battle. The night of October 24, 1942, was dark and rainy and filled with the sounds of dying men. John Basilone stood in that darkness with a machine gun that was never meant to be carried by one person, and he held his ground until the enemy was destroyed. 60 Japanese soldiers in 15 minutes, one Marine against the night. A story that will be told as long as there are Marines to tell it. The Battle of Guadalcanal was a turning point in the Pacific War. Before Guadalcanal, the Japanese military had seemed unstoppable. They had conquered vast territories with stunning speed, crushing Allied forces wherever they met. The fall of Singapore, the conquest of the Philippines, the rapid advance through Southeast Asia, all of these suggested that Japanese victory was inevitable. After Guadalcanal, the myth of Japanese invincibility was shattered. The Marines had proven that American soldiers could fight the Japanese on equal terms and win. The tide of the war had turned. John Basilone's stand on that rainy October night was a crucial moment in that turning point. His machine guns held a section of line that could not be allowed to fall. His courage inspired the Marines around him to fight harder, to endure more than they thought possible. His example showed what American fighting men were capable of when their backs were against the wall. The Pacific War continued for nearly 3 more years after Guadalcanal. American forces fought their way across islands with names that would become synonymous with sacrifice. Tarawa, where Marines died in the shallow waters approaching the beach. Saipan, where Japanese civilians threw themselves from cliffs rather than surrender. Peleliu, where the fighting was so brutal that combat veterans called it worse than anything they had experienced. Okinawa, the final stepping stone before the invasion of Japan itself. Each island cost thousands of American lives. Each island brought the war closer to its conclusion. John Basilone did not live to see the end, but he played his part in the victory that followed. His sacrifice on Iwo Jima helped secure an island that would save thousands of lives in the final months of the war. The bombers that landed there might otherwise have crashed into the Pacific. The airmen who survived because of those emergency airfields went on to complete their missions and hasten the end of the conflict. The atomic bombs that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 brought the war to its final end. Japan surrendered, and the long nightmare of the Pacific War was finally over. The young men who had survived came home to build families and careers and lives that would have been impossible without the sacrifices of those who did not return. John Basilone was one of those who did not return. But his legacy lived on in the Marines he trained, in the positions he held, in the example he set for generations to come. The weapon that his commanders called too heavy turned out to be exactly heavy enough to hold a line that could not be allowed to break, heavy enough to kill 60 enemy soldiers in 15 minutes of continuous fire, heavy enough to save Henderson Field and change the course of the Pacific War. John Basilone carried that weight because someone had to. He carried it because he could. He carried it because the Marines, depending on him, had no one else. That was the kind of man he was. The next time you think something is too heavy, too difficult, too impossible, remember Manila John Basilone. Remember the weapon that weighed 90 pounds. Remember the 60 soldiers who fell before it. Remember the 15 minutes that changed the course of a battle. Remember that the weight of any burden depends on the strength of the person carrying it. And remember that strength, true strength, comes not from muscles alone, but from the heart that refuses to quit, the mind that refuses to accept defeat, the spirit that refuses to leave brothers behind. That was John Basilone's strength. That was his gift to the Marine Corps and to America. That is his gift to all of us, if we are wise enough to accept it. He was Manila John. He was a Marine. He was a hero. He was proof that nothing is too heavy when everything depends on it. The story of John Basilone resonates across the decades because it speaks to something universal in human experience. We all face moments when the burden seems too great, when the odds seem insurmountable, when giving up seems like the only rational choice. In those moments, we can remember a young man from New Jersey who refused to accept that anything was impossible. We can remember that courage is not about being unafraid, but about acting despite fear. We can remember that one person, determined and skilled, can make a difference that echoes through history. John Basilone did not choose to be a hero. He simply did what needed to be done, and he did it better than anyone had a right to expect. In doing so, he became something larger than himself, a symbol of everything the Marine Corps represents. Semper Fidelis, always faithful. John Basilone was faithful to his brothers, faithful to his country, faithful to the weapon that others had dismissed as too heavy to carry. His faithfulness cost him his life, but it earned him immortality. The Marines remember. America remembers. The world should remember. This is the story of Manila John Basilone. This is the story of the too heavy weapon. This is the story of what one man can accomplish when everything is on the line. And it is a true story, which makes it all the more remarkable. In an age of exaggeration and embellishment, John Barcelone's deeds speak for themselves. The bodies before his position on Guadalcanal were counted and documented. The blockhouse he destroyed on Iwo Jima was witnessed by multiple Marines. The medals he received were earned through actions that were verified and confirmed. He was not a myth. He was a man who discovered that he was capable of extraordinary things when ordinary things were no longer enough. That is perhaps the most important lesson of all. John Barcelone was not born special. He did not possess superhuman abilities. He was a restless kid from New Jersey who could not sit still in school. He was an ordinary soldier who happened to have an extraordinary talent for machine guns. What made him different was his willingness to use that talent when it mattered most. What made him a hero was his refusal to accept that anything was impossible. What made him legendary was his choice to return to combat when he could have stayed safe. These were choices that anyone could make. They were choices that required no special gifts, no unusual advantages, no favors from fate. They required only the will to act and the courage to accept the consequences. John Barcelone made those choices, and the world was changed because of them. His story is not finished. It will never be finished. As long as there are people who believe that courage matters, that sacrifice has meaning, that one person can make a difference, John Barcelone will live on. The too-heavy weapon was not really about weight at all. It was about will. It was about determination. It was about love for the men fighting beside you. John Barcelone understood this better than anyone. He carried that understanding to his grave on the black sands of Iwo Jima, and he left it behind for generations, yet unborn. He was proof that nothing is too heavy when everything depends on it. And that is a lesson worth remembering. The machine gun that John Barcelone carried on Guadalcanal is now preserved in a military museum, a piece of steel and wood that once dealt death on a massive scale. Visitors look at the weapon and struggle to imagine carrying it into combat. They lift it and feel the weight, and they understand in a visceral way what John accomplished. The weapon itself is unremarkable in appearance. It is utilitarian, designed for function rather than beauty. The metal shows wear from heavy use, the wood is stained and scarred. But in the context of military history, this particular weapon is priceless. It represents a moment when individual skill and determination changed the course of a battle. The M1917 design has long since been superseded by lighter, more advanced weapons. Modern machine guns weigh half as much and fire at twice the rate. Technology has marched forward, as it always does in the military. But the fundamental challenge remains the same. Someone must carry the weapon. Someone must aim it. Someone must keep it firing when everything suggests it should stop. That someone must have the skill, the strength, and the will to continue when continuing seems impossible. John Barcelone possessed all three qualities in abundance. His story reminds us that technology alone does not win wars. The best weapons in the world are useless without the men who operate them. The most sophisticated tactics fail without leaders who can implement them under fire. Military success ultimately depends on individual human beings making decisions in moments of extreme stress. On Guadalcanal, John Barcelone made the right decisions repeatedly. He positioned his guns correctly. He maintained them under difficult conditions. He rationed his ammunition wisely. He moved when movement was necessary and held when holding was required. Each decision was small in itself, but together they added up to victory. This is the nature of combat. Grand strategies are planned in comfortable headquarters, but battles are won or lost in the mud and rain by men who simply do their jobs correctly. John Barcelone understood this implicitly. He never claimed to be a strategist or a tactician. He was a machine gunner, and he focused on being the best machine gunner possible. That focus, that dedication to excellence in a specific skill, made him invaluable when the crisis came. The Marines who died on Guadalcanal deserve better than to be forgotten. Their names are inscribed on memorials. Their bodies were buried with honor. But as the years pass, individual stories fade. The complexities of their lives are reduced to dates and places, names on lists of casualties. John Basilone's story keeps their memory alive. When people learn about John, they learn about the battle he fought. They learn about the desperate nature of the fighting on Guadalcanal. They learn about the thousands of Marines who held Henderson Field against overwhelming odds. His individual story becomes a window into the larger collective experience. This is one reason why military organizations preserve and promote stories of individual heroism. These stories serve a practical purpose beyond simply honoring the dead. They teach lessons that cannot be conveyed through abstract doctrine. They illustrate principles that might otherwise remain theoretical. When a young Marine hears about John Basilone, that Marine learns something about what it means to be a Marine. The lesson is not about superhuman abilities or impossible feats. It is about doing your job well, even when circumstances make that job incredibly difficult. It is about putting the welfare of your unit above your personal safety. It is about mastering your craft so completely that you can perform under the worst possible conditions. These are lessons that apply regardless of the specific military technology or tactics of the era. They are timeless principles that have guided successful military forces throughout history. John Basilone exemplified these principles perfectly. The fact that he returned to combat after being given every opportunity to stay safe speaks volumes about his character. He could have spent the rest of the war as a celebrity, selling bonds and giving speeches. He would have been honored and respected. He would have survived, but he chose to fight instead because he believed that was where he belonged. This choice, more than his actions on Guadalcanal, defines who John Basilone was. It shows that his heroism was not a one-time aberration, a moment of courage in an otherwise ordinary life. It was fundamental to his nature. He was a warrior, and warriors fight. The Marine Corps understood what it was losing when John Basilone returned to combat. They had tried to keep him safe, tried to preserve their living symbol of American fighting spirit, but they also understood that they could not force him to stay. A Marine who volunteers to return to combat, despite having already proven himself beyond any doubt, exemplifies the core values in the most profound way possible. By allowing John to return to the fight, the Marine Corps honored those values, even though it meant accepting the risk of losing him. The risk became reality on Iwo Jima. John Basilone's death was a blow to Marine Corps morale. He had been a symbol of hope, a living example that ordinary men could perform extraordinary acts. His death reminded everyone that courage does not guarantee survival. Heroes are not immortal. They bleed and die like everyone else. But his death also reinforced his legend. He had fought at the front of his unit until the very end. He had led by example until the moment he fell. He had died the way he had lived, as a Marine among Marines. This consistency between his life and his death gave his story a completeness that resonated deeply. John Basilone was not a complex man. He did not philosophize about war or question his role in it. He saw himself as a Marine, and he did what Marines do. This simplicity made him relatable. He was not a distant figure whose motivations were obscure. He was understandable, recognizable, human. People could imagine themselves in his place, facing his choices. This relatability is part of what makes his story so powerful. We can all understand the weight of a burden that seems too heavy, We have all faced tasks that seemed impossible. We have all had moments when we wanted to quit. John Basilone's story tells us that these feelings are normal, but they do not have to control our actions. We can carry the weight. We can complete the task. We can push through the difficulty. The only question is whether we will make that choice. After the war, many veterans struggled to process their experiences. They had seen and done things that changed them fundamentally. They carried memories that would never fade. Many of them found it difficult to talk about what they had been through. The gap between their wartime experiences and their peacetime lives seemed unbridgeable. John Basilone never had to face this struggle. He died in combat, and in a sense, that was fitting. He had been most alive when he was fighting. The peacetime world might have seemed as confining to him as it had before the war. He might have spent years feeling out of place, unable to recapture the sense of purpose he had felt in combat. His death spared him this disillusionment. He remains frozen in time as a warrior, defined entirely by his actions in battle. This makes his story cleaner, more perfect than the messier reality of most veterans' lives, but it also makes him a somewhat distant figure. The John Basilone we remember is the man who carried the heavy machine gun, not the man who might have grown old and raised a family. We know him only through his greatest moments, not through the decades of ordinary life that might have followed. Lena May Basilone carried that knowledge of the man behind the legend. She had known John as a husband, not just as a hero. She had seen his quiet moments, his vulnerabilities, his humanity. Her long life after his death kept that fuller picture of John alive. Through her stories and memories, people could glimpse the man who had existed alongside the warrior. She gave talks at schools and veterans' events, sharing what she remembered of her brief marriage. She spoke of John's humor, his kindness, his nervousness on their wedding day. These small details humanized him, made him more than just a collection of combat citations. She also spoke honestly about the cost of his choice to return to combat. She had known that he might not come home. She had accepted that possibility when she married him. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it emotionally are very different. The telegram informing her of John's death had destroyed her world. She rebuilt her life around his memory, finding purpose in keeping his story alive. This too was a kind of courage, different from John's but no less real. Lena May Basilone showed that heroism can take many forms. Not all acts of courage happen on battlefields. Some happen in the quiet determination to continue living after devastating loss. The John Basilone Parade in Raritan has become more than just a memorial to one man. It has evolved into a celebration of military service generally. Veterans from all wars and all branches attend. Current military members march alongside the older veterans, connecting past and present. The parade includes bands, speeches and ceremonies. Local businesses sponsor floats. School groups participate. The entire town comes together for the event. For one day each year, Raritan remembers that it produced a genuine American hero. But the parade also serves a deeper purpose. It reminds everyone that heroes come from ordinary places. John Basilone was not from a wealthy family. He did not attend prestigious schools. He had no special advantages. He came from Raritan, New Jersey, a town like thousands of other American towns. If Raritan could produce a John Basilone, then any town could produce heroes. This democratic notion of heroism is fundamentally American. We believe that greatness can emerge from anywhere, that ordinary people can rise to extraordinary challenges. John Basilone's story confirms this belief. He proves that background and education and social status matter less than character and determination. The statue of John Basilone in the Raritan town square captures him in a moment of intense action. He is crouched behind his machine gun, his face set in concentration, his hands on the weapon. The sculptor chose to depict him in combat rather than in a dress uniform, receiving his Medal of Honor. This choice emphasizes that John was, first and foremost, a fighting Marine. The statue has become a landmark and a gathering place. Veterans visit it to pay their respects. School groups stop there during local history lessons. Tourists photograph it. It serves as a constant physical reminder of John's presence in the town. Bronze cannot capture the full reality of what John Basilone accomplished. No statue can convey the sound of the machine gun firing continuously for 15 minutes. No sculpture can show the exhaustion of fighting for 2 days without sleep. No artwork can represent the fear and determination that John must have felt. But the statue serves its purpose. It marks the place where John came from. It gives people a focal point for their memories and respect. It ensures that future generations will know that something significant happened here, that someone important came from this place. The museums dedicated to John Basilone's memory contain artifacts from his life. His Medal of Honor is displayed alongside photographs from his childhood. His uniform is preserved behind glass. Letters he wrote home are carefully maintained. These physical objects connect us to John in a tangible way. They prove that he was real, not just a story or a legend. The exhibits trace his life from birth through his military service to his death on Iwo Jima. Visitors can follow his journey and understand the arc of his life. The museums also place John's story in the larger context of World War II. They explain the strategic importance of Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima. They describe the weapons and tactics of the era. They provide information about the Marine Corps and its role in the Pacific War. This context helps visitors understand that John's individual heroism was part of a massive collective effort. Millions of Americans served in World War II. Thousands performed acts of courage that went unrecognized. John Basilone happened to be in the right place at the right time for his actions to be witnessed and documented. But he represented all the Marines who fought beside him, known and unknown, decorated and unrecognized. The story of John Basilone reminds us of what that generation accomplished. They fought a war on multiple continents against enemies who seemed unstoppable. They endured conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. They persevered through setbacks and disasters until ultimate victory was achieved. John Basilone was one man among millions, but his story illuminates the experience of them all. When we honor John, we honor every Marine who fought in the Pacific. When we remember his courage, we acknowledge the courage of countless others who faced similar dangers. When we study his example, we learn lessons that apply to all of military history. This is the power of individual stories in understanding collective experiences. We cannot comprehend the scale of a war that killed tens of millions of people. The numbers are too large, the suffering too vast. But we can understand one man carrying a heavy machine gun through the rain, fighting to protect his fellow Marines. That story has a human scale. It connects to our own experiences of struggle and perseverance. Through John's story, we gain a window into the larger historical reality. The weapon was too heavy. That was the conventional wisdom. No single man should try to carry and operate an M117 in mobile combat. It was foolish to attempt it. The weight alone made it impractical. The complexity of operation made it dangerous. John Basilone ignored the conventional wisdom. He studied the weapon until he knew it completely. He trained his body until he could carry the weight. He practiced until he could operate it under any conditions. When the moment came, the impossible weapon became the decisive factor. The lesson is clear. Conventional wisdom has its place, but it should not limit what we attempt. Some tasks are genuinely impossible. No amount of determination will allow a human being to fly unaided or breathe underwater. Physical reality imposes hard limits, but many things that seem impossible are merely very difficult. They require exceptional skill, exceptional effort, exceptional determination. Most people will never achieve them because most people are not willing to pay the price. John Basilone was willing to pay the price. He devoted himself to mastering the M1917 machine gun. He built his strength to the point where he could carry it. He developed the endurance to operate it for extended periods. He learned to maintain it under combat conditions. All of this preparation happened before he ever fired a shot in anger. When the battle came, John did not suddenly develop superhuman abilities. He simply applied the skills he had spent years developing. His training took over. His body performed the actions it had practiced thousands of times. The impossible became routine because he had made it routine through preparation. This is another timeless lesson from John's story. Success in moments of crisis comes from preparation during times of relative calm. You cannot develop skills under fire. You cannot build strength during a battle. You cannot learn your weapon while the enemy is attacking. All of that must happen beforehand. The Marines understand this principle. They train constantly, drilling until every action becomes automatic. They study their equipment until they can operate it in the dark. They condition their bodies to function under extreme stress. When combat comes, they rely on their training. John Basilone exemplified this approach. He did not wait for a crisis to prepare. He prepared constantly, making himself ready for whatever might come. When the crisis arrived, he was ready. The weight that would have crushed an unprepared man was merely difficult for John because he had prepared himself to carry it. His story teaches us to prepare before we need to perform. It teaches us that the hard work we do in peaceful times may save our lives in dangerous times. It teaches us that mastery comes from dedicated practice, not from luck or talent alone. These lessons extend far beyond the military. Anyone facing difficult challenges can learn from John Basilone's example. The student preparing for a crucial exam, the athlete training for an important competition, the professional developing skills for a career, they all face the same basic challenge. They must prepare themselves for a moment when performance will matter. They must develop their abilities to the point where they can execute under pressure. They must make the difficult seem routine through repeated practice. John Basilone carried a machine gun that weighed 90 pounds. Modern students carry knowledge that sometimes feels just as heavy. Modern workers carry responsibilities that sometimes seem overwhelming. Modern parents carry burdens that can feel impossible to bear. The weight is different, but the challenge is the same. Will you carry it? Can you carry it? How will you prepare yourself to carry it? John Basilone answered those questions through his actions. He carried the weight because it needed to be carried. He prepared himself to carry it through years of dedicated practice. He succeeded because he refused to accept that success was impossible. We cannot all be John Basilone. We will not all face the same life or death situations. We will not all have opportunities for such dramatic acts of courage. But we can all face our own challenges with the same determination that John demonstrated. We can all prepare ourselves for the difficult moments we know are coming. We can all carry the weight that our particular circumstances place on us. The machine gun was too heavy for most men. It was exactly the right weight for John Basilone. The challenges you face may seem too difficult for most people, but they might be exactly right for you if you prepare yourself properly and refuse to quit. That is the final lesson of the too heavy weapon. It was not about the weapon at all. It was about the man who carried it. It was about John Basilone's refusal to accept limitations. It was about his determination to be ready for whatever came. It was about his willingness to do what needed to be done, regardless of how difficult it seemed. The weapon was heavy. The challenge was real. The danger was mortal. John Basilone carried the weight anyway. He faced the challenge directly. He accepted the danger willingly. He did what needed to be done. That is why we remember him. That is why his story matters. That is why the too heavy weapon became the perfect weapon in his hands. John Basilone proved that nothing is too heavy when everything depends on it. He proved that preparation and determination can overcome seemingly impossible odds. He proved that one person, properly trained and utterly committed, can change the outcome of a battle. These truths remain as valid today as they were on Guadalcanal in 1942. The specific weapons have changed. The specific tactics have evolved. But the fundamental realities of human courage and determination remain constant. John Basilone's story will continue to inspire as long as people face difficult challenges and wonder whether they have the strength to overcome them. His answer was simple and direct. You have the strength if you develop it. You can carry the weight if you prepare yourself. You can succeed if you refuse to quit. The weapon was never too heavy. It was exactly as heavy as it needed to be. John Basilone was exactly as strong as he needed to be. The match was perfect, and the result was victory. That is the story of Manila John Basilone and the too heavy weapon that saved Henderson Field and changed the course of the Pacific War. The ripples of John Basilone's actions extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation on Guadalcanal. His stand helped preserve Henderson Field, which became the cornerstone of American operations in the South Pacific for months to come. Aircraft flying from Henderson Field struck Japanese shipping and bases throughout the region. The airfield that John helped save became a dagger pointed at the heart of Japanese ambitions in the Pacific. The Japanese High Command understood the significance of losing Guadalcanal. They had committed enormous resources to retaking the island, and the failure of the October offensive marked a turning point in their strategic calculations. Before Guadalcanal, they had been on the offensive, conquering new territories and expanding their empire. After Guadalcanal, they were on the defensive, trying to hold what they had already taken. This shift from offense to defense had profound psychological effects on both sides. The Japanese military had cultivated an image of invincibility. Their rapid conquests in 1941 and early 1942 had seemed to confirm that they were unstoppable. Guadalcanal shattered that image. The Americans and their allies realized that Japan could be defeated. This realization transformed the nature of the war in the Pacific. What had seemed like an impossible task, defeating Japan and liberating the occupied territories, suddenly seemed achievable. Morale improved throughout the Allied forces, recruitment increased, war production accelerated. John Basilone became a symbol of this shift. His story was told and retold in newspapers, on radio broadcasts, in newsreels shown in movie theaters. Here was proof that individual Americans could stand against Japanese forces and win. If one Marine with a machine gun could kill 60 enemy soldiers, then surely America, with all its industrial might, could defeat Japan completely. The propaganda value of John's story should not diminish our appreciation of his genuine courage. The fact that his heroism was used to inspire the home front does not make it any less real. John Basilone actually did the things that were claimed about him. The propaganda was based on truth, not fabrication. This distinguishes his story from the invented or exaggerated tales that sometimes emerged during the war. John's actions were witnessed by other Marines and verified by his commanding officers. The bodies of the Japanese soldiers he killed were counted. The physical evidence supported the claims. When the Marine Corps promoted his story, they were promoting genuine heroism, not creating a myth from whole cloth. John himself was uncomfortable with this promotion because he understood that many other Marines had performed similar acts of courage without recognition. He knew that his actions, while extraordinary, were not unique. Other machine gunners held other positions during the same battle. Other Marines fought with equal courage and determination. The difference was that John's position happened to be particularly critical, and his actions happened to be particularly well documented. The randomness of military glory bothered John. Why should he receive a Medal of Honor when other men who had fought just as bravely received nothing? The answer is that military decorations are always somewhat arbitrary. They depend on who witnessed the action, who wrote the citations, who pushed the paperwork through the bureaucracy. Countless acts of courage go unrecognized simply because no one with authority happened to see them or because the witnesses did not survive to testify. John understood this, and it made his Medal of Honor feel less like an achievement and more like a responsibility. He had been chosen, somewhat arbitrarily, to represent all the Marines who had fought on Guadalcanal. His medal honored them as much as it honored him. This understanding drove his decision to return to combat. He could not enjoy his status as a hero while other Marines continued to fight and die. The honor felt wrong unless he shared the risks that other Marines faced. His death on Iwo Jima completed the arc of his story in a way that resonated deeply with military culture. He had not sought glory and then retreated to safety. He had fought until the end. This gave his example a purity that inspired generations of Marines who came after him. The training that John received in the Philippines proved invaluable on Guadalcanal. The skills he developed through countless hours of practice became automatic under fire. His hands knew what to do even when his conscious mind was overwhelmed by the chaos of combat. This is the goal of all military training, to develop skills to the point where they become reflexive. When bullets are flying and explosions are happening all around, there is no time for conscious thought. Training must take over. The body must perform the necessary actions automatically. John's extensive self-training with the M1917 achieved this ideal. He could clear jams without looking. He could feed ammunition belts by feel. He could traverse the weapon and adjust his aim through muscle memory alone. These skills, developed in peacetime, saved his life and the lives of countless other Marines during the battle. Modern military training explicitly recognizes this principle. Soldiers drill the same actions hundreds or thousands of times until they become automatic. Combat simulations try to replicate the stress and chaos of real battles so that soldiers can learn to function under those conditions. All of this stems from the understanding that conscious thought fails under extreme stress. Only deeply ingrained training remains reliable. John Basilone instinctively understood this principle, even though he had no formal training in psychology or pedagogy. He simply knew from experience that the more he practiced, the better he performed under pressure. So he practiced obsessively, developing his skills to a level far beyond what was required or expected. This personal initiative made him exceptional. Most soldiers do what is required of them and nothing more. They meet the standards, but do not exceed them. John was different. He pushed himself beyond the minimum requirements because he understood that minimum standards might not be enough when the crisis came. His self-directed training program in the Philippines was not required or even officially sanctioned. It was something he chose to do on his own time because he believed it was necessary. This level of personal initiative is rare in any organization. Most people do what they are told and nothing more. They wait for instructions rather than acting on their own judgment. They meet expectations rather than exceeding them. John Basilone shows us what becomes possible when someone takes personal initiative seriously. He did not wait for someone to teach him everything he needed to know. He sought out knowledge actively. He identified his own weaknesses and worked to correct them. He set his own standards and held himself accountable to them. These habits of self-improvement made him exceptional long before he ever saw combat. When the battle came, he was prepared not because someone had prepared him, but because he had prepared himself. This distinction is crucial. External training can only accomplish so much. Real excellence comes from internal motivation, from personal commitment to being the best possible version of yourself. John Basilone possessed this internal motivation in abundance. He did not need external rewards or punishments to drive his improvement. He was motivated by an internal standard of excellence that demanded his best effort regardless of whether anyone was watching. This kind of character cannot be trained into people. It must come from within. Military organizations try to identify individuals who possess this trait and give them opportunities to develop it further. John Basilone was exactly the kind of person the Marines value most, someone who takes personal responsibility for their own excellence. His story has been used in Marine Corps training for decades to illustrate the kind of initiative and dedication the Corps expects from its members. Young Marines learn about John Basilone and understand that they are joining an organization with standards of excellence that go far beyond minimum requirements. The expectation is not just to be competent, but to be exceptional. The expectation is not just to follow orders, but to take initiative. The expectation is not just to survive, but to accomplish the mission regardless of personal cost. These are demanding expectations, and not everyone can meet them, but those who can become part of a tradition of excellence that stretches back through generations of Marines. John Basilone is one of the brightest stars in that tradition, a Marine who exemplified everything the Corps values. His story reminds current Marines of what they are aspiring to become. It gives them a concrete example of the abstract values they are taught. It shows them that ordinary people from ordinary backgrounds can achieve extraordinary things through dedication and courage. The Browning M1917 machine gun was obsolete by modern standards long before John Basilone ever touched one. It was a World War I design that had been superseded by more advanced weapons, but it was available, and John mastered it. He did not complain about having old equipment or demand newer weapons. He simply learned to use what he had with maximum effectiveness. This pragmatic attitude is another lesson from his story. We often want perfect conditions before we commit to excellence. We want the best equipment, the ideal circumstances, the perfect preparation. But perfect conditions rarely exist, especially in military operations. Success usually comes from making the most of whatever resources are available. John Basilone took an obsolete, awkward, heavy weapon and turned it into a decisive factor in battle. He did this not through any special technology, but through superior skill and determination. The weapon was the same one that other soldiers found unmanageable. John made it work through personal excellence. This teaches us that the limiting factor is usually not the tool, but the person using the tool. Better equipment helps, certainly, but it is not sufficient. A master craftsman with basic tools will outperform an amateur with the best equipment available. John Basilone was a master craftsman with the M1917 machine gun. His mastery came from understanding the weapon completely, from practicing with it extensively, from pushing himself to exceed normal standards of proficiency. When we face challenges with imperfect tools or less than ideal circumstances, we can remember John Basilone. We can remember that excellence is possible even with limitations. We can remember that mastery comes from dedicated practice, not from perfect equipment. We can remember that the weight of the burden matters less than the strength of the person carrying it. The ultimate tribute to John Basilone is not the memorials or the parade or the museum exhibits. The ultimate tribute is that his story continues to inspire people more than 80 years after his death on Iwo Jima. New generations of Marines learn about Manila John and find motivation in his example. Civilians who have never served in the military read about him and find lessons applicable to their own lives. His story has transcended its original context to become a universal tale about courage and determination. This universality is what makes certain stories endure across generations. The specific details are tied to a particular time and place, but the underlying themes are timeless. Human beings have always faced challenges that seemed too difficult. We have always had to find the strength to carry on when carrying on seemed impossible. We have always needed examples of what human courage and determination can accomplish. John Basilone provides such an example. His story tells us that the impossible is often merely very difficult. It tells us that preparation and training can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. It tells us that individual human beings can make a difference even in the largest collective enterprises. These messages remain relevant regardless of the specific challenges we face. The machine gun was too heavy. John Basilone carried it anyway. The enemy was too numerous. John Basilone fought them anyway. The situation was too desperate. John Basilone held his position anyway. This pattern of refusing to accept defeat, of continuing to fight regardless of circumstances, defines John's legacy. He shows us that victory is possible even when it seems impossible. He shows us that one determined individual can change outcomes. He shows us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite fear. The next time you face a challenge that seems too difficult, remember the Marine from New Jersey who carried a weapon that everyone said was too heavy. Remember that he succeeded not through superhuman abilities, but through preparation, skill, and determination. Remember that these qualities are available to anyone willing to develop them. Remember that nothing is too heavy when everything depends on it. That was John Basilone's truth, and it can be your truth as well. The weight you carry may be different, but the principle remains the same. You can carry it if you prepare yourself properly. You can succeed if you refuse to quit. You can accomplish extraordinary things if you are willing to do the work. John Basilone proved this on a rainy October night in 1942, and his example continues to prove it today. The machine gun that was too heavy turned out to be exactly the right weight for the man who carried it. And the man who carried it turned out to be exactly what his fellow Marines needed in their moment of greatest danger. That perfect match between man and moment is what we remember and honor. That is the story of Manila John Basilone and the weapon that changed the course of the Pacific War.